Hello everyone, this is John Olegas, and I'm going to talk about a comparative analysis of three forms of equity compensation. Those forms are restricted stock, traditional employee stock options, and dynamic employee stock options, a concept which I created. Here we go. All right, we're going to compare a grant of 10,000 restricted shares to a grant of 25,000 traditional employee stock options, and also we're going to compare the restricted stock and the traditional employee stock options with dynamic employee stock options, that is 24,200. Dynamic employee stock options are employee stock options where the time value is not forfeited upon exercise, but is returned as new employee stock options when the exercise is made. Okay, assume the stock is 20 at the grant and the exercise price for the ESOs is 20. We assume that the theoretical values at grant of the 10,500 restricted stock is equal to the 25,000 traditional employee stock options and 24,120 dynamic employee stock options. Our calculations show that dynamic employee stock options are 3.5% more valuable than traditional employee stock options on the day of grant. So to make the comparison as equal as possible, we compare 3.5% less dynamic employee stock options with the restricted stock and traditional employee stock options. All right. Okay, so we're going to assume here a volatility of 30. We're going to assume the risk-free interest rate is 1.1% and there is no dividend. We assume that the expected time to expiration is 2,200 days from the grant of the ESOs, although the maximum contractual life is 10 years. And we discounted the value of the restricted stock by 5% from the market value on the grant date. So we made all of those assumptions to calculate the value of the employee stock options, and those assumptions work out to where it makes the total employee stock options and dynamic employee stock options equal to the restricted stock in value on the grant date. Okay, so now we're going to examine the consequences for each of those three positions, that is the 10,000 restricted stock and the 25,000 traditional employee stock options and the 24,200 dynamic employee stock options. We're going to investigate the three positions under the three different assumptions of the stock price immediately after a 3-year vesting period. Okay, so let's take first of all a look at the restricted stock, and we're assuming that the stock is trading at 27. So the stock is trading at 27 with a total value of vested options, which is 10,500, and the value is $283,500 after vesting. Federal and state taxes become due now because that's when taxes on restricted stock come due. It's on the vesting date. And so the federal and state taxes are due by the employee on the total value, even if no stock is sold. In California, the taxes could be as high as 50%. At least 50% of the stock, in all probability, must be sold to pay for the 50% tax. And probably 100% will be sold if the holder uses the sell and diversify strategy as valuable. The grantee will net $141,750, and those proceeds would probably be diversified and get whatever value there is of diversification over holding one stock. There's no alignment left after the sale of the stock. Okay, so the 3 years go by, and most of the time all the stock is sold and there's no alignment left after the vesting period with restricted stock. The company will receive a cash flow from the tax deduction. The actual cost of the company is $283,500, and the cash flow from the tax deduction would be perhaps 43.8% of the $283,500, which is $124,173 in California. All right, now let's look at what traditional employee stock options are like when the stock is 27 with an exercise price of 20. The traditional employee stock options have a value of 7 times, remember we're using 25,000 now, and that is equal to 175,000, and there is remaining $84,000 of time premium or time value. Now, in my opinion, no informed grantee should exercise the traditional employee stock options at this point because of the large penalties, that is the forfeiture of the time value and paying an early tax, and they outweigh any advantages of diversifying as far as risk reduction. If risk reduction is sought, then exchange-traded calls should be sold, perhaps those with an exercise price of 30. Using the sale of the calls to reduce risk will not create any early cash flows for the company, nor will it reduce the company's liability to perform under the traditional employee stock option contract. The dynamic employee stock options would have a value of 96.5 of the figures in the above paragraph on the traditional employee stock options. However, it may not be unreasonable for the grantee to exercise and sell when the stock is 27, since the remaining time value is not forfeited. It is credited back to the grantee upon exercise in the form of new dynamic employee stock options. Okay, so the biggest penalty for early exercising when you have traditional employee stock options is the time value forfeiture. Whereas if you eliminate that by making it part of the dynamic employee contract to give back the time value that is otherwise forfeited, then a lot of times it's not that inefficient to exercise even when the stock's 27, you have an exercise price of 20. Therefore, the only penalty to the grantee is that the grantee pays an early tax on the intrinsic value. The grantee of the dynamic employee stock options who receives these new options on exercise, he must also wait another vesting period to be able to exercise the new dynamic employee stock options, and he thus maintains an alignment with the shareholders after the sale of stock for perhaps at least another 3 years. If the dynamic employee stock options grantee exercises and sells, the gain before tax is perhaps $168,875. But the grantee receives new dynamic employee stock options worth $81,060 with a new 10-year life and an exercise price of 27. And alignment continues, although it's not a full continuance, a full alignment as it was before, but there is a substantial alignment that continues, and the company gets 2 cash flows when he makes this early exercise. First of all, the flows come from the issuance of the stock and the sale of new shares to the grantee at 20, and so for 20,200 shares, That's $480,000 of cash flow plus tax savings from the deductions of the intrinsic value equal to 7 times 24,200, which is worth 169,400 times 43.8%. So he gets another cash flow of 74,197. The total cash flow then is 558,197, even though the actual cost is just 168,875. So much of the risk to the grantee was eliminated efficiently without hedging. The same analysis with the stock at 37 instead of 27 at vesting after 3 years follows. 100% of the post-restricted stock will generally be sold immediately after vesting, with the remaining after-tax amount perhaps at risk in a diversified portfolio. The company deducts the $388,500 as it is a real cost, but the deduction generates cash flow of about $170,163. We're talking about restricted stock here, and that's in California, which is actually less than the tax paid by the grantee on the restricted stock at vesting. After the sale of the stock, again, there is no more alignment between the grantee and the shareholders, so the 3-year alignment costs the company $388,500, but it does get to deduct the amount, and it gets a tax credit for that. The traditional employee stock options have an intrinsic value of 17 when the stock's 37, and so multiplying that by 25,000, we get 425,000 of gain that he would make if he exercised, and the remaining time value is just $2 above the intrinsic, and but on 25,000 shares, that's worth 56,250. The remaining time value would be forfeited again upon early exercise, and an early tax will have to be paid. Both are not incidental penalties even under these circumstances. Even with the stock at 37, the only efficient strategy, again, is to sell calls or buy puts. Of course, the companies themselves do not want grantees to hedge, since with the hedging, the companies get none of their liability reduced when the remaining time value is forfeited. Their liability is reduced when the time value is forfeited, but of course, if they hedge, they don't forfeit any time value. And the cash flows of the company are delayed when you hedge. Perhaps the cash flows will never come at all if hedging is done and the stock then goes below the exercise price at expiration. With dynamic employee stock options, the exercise forfeits no time value, as new ESOs are delivered upon exercise, whose value equals the otherwise forfeited time value. So an exercise and sale of stock when the stock is 37 gets the following results. 17 times 24.2 equals 411.4, and that's the intrinsic value, and the remaining time value is 54,281. So the actual cost is 411,400 plus the value of the new dynamic employee stock options that you issued upon exercise of the original dynamic employee stock options, and you're getting new dynamic employee stock options of 54,281 in value. In addition, the cash flows to the company are the following: 484,000 plus the tax deduction on the intrinsic value of the 411, and that generates perhaps 181,193 in tax credits. So the total cash flow is 665 193. This is far more than the cash flow than when the restricted stock goes to 37 at vesting. So now we'll make the assumption that the stock goes down 15% and trades at 17 at vesting, down 3 points from 20. Now let's examine the situation where the stock is trading at 17 shortly after vesting. The grantee of the restricted stock sells and diversifies and no longer has any alignment. The actual cost to the company is $178,500 with this restricted stock grant, and the cash flows to the company is 43.8% of that, which is $78,183. So the grantee is paid $178,500 when the stock drops 15% from the grant date and there is no longer any alignment. This does not seem like a performance award to me, and in fact it's not. When the stock is trading at 17, the traditional employee stock options and the dynamic employee stock options have no intrinsic value, and both have lost considerable time value from the time erosion of the options. The grantee has no choice but to hold on to the ESOs and the DESOs. There's been no actual cost as yet to the company, although there may be an accounting expense against earnings equal to the fair value at grant. There's been no cash flow to the company, and the alignment of grantee shareholders has been reduced, but a substantial alignment still exists. Even when the stock is trading at 17, you have an exercise price of 20, and 3 years have gone by and you have a vesting. You still have a substantial alignment. So here's a summary of the different results at the different prices. Okay, we see that the gain to the grantee before tax for restricted stock is $283,500 when the stock's 27. There's less of a profit or gain to the holder of the traditional employee stock options, assuming he exercises. And of course we can see the cash flows in this column that come as a result of the tax deduction, and in this column we see the cash flows to the company from the exercises and the issuance of the new shares. All right, so we see the gains and the cash flows. The cash flows are minimal with regard to restricted stock in comparison to the cash flows that come from the employee stock options. And with the dynamic employee stock options, you get a little less, but you do get new employee stock options which are received upon exercise, and that 9,650 is equal to the number of new employee stock options that you get. Okay, so all of these numbers assume that the dynamic employee stock options are exercised when the stock is 27. All right, so now let's look at the same illustration when the stock's 37. So again, the gain to the grantee before tax are these figures here. All right, and it's not too far different. However, the cash flows for the tax deduction is not that big a difference either, although the restricted stock, you're getting less value than the two types of employee stock options. But the big difference in the cash flows is the amounts from exercising. Okay, and again, under this scenario, with the dynamic employee stock options, will give new employee stock options received upon exercise of $47.12, and that is because the value of the otherwise offered a time premium is given back in the form of new employee stock options with new exercise prices equal to the current value in a 10-year life, which in fact extends the alignment. All right? So, and here's the summary of what happens when the stock is 17 at vesting. Restricted stock, you get tonight's payment. The company that writes it off and gets a tax deduction. There's no cash flows from exercising because restricted stocks aren't exercised. There's no new ESOs. And the traditional and the options, both the traditional and the dynamic, they don't get any cash because there's no intrinsic value because the stock's down. There's no flows to the company, and there's no exercising, and there's therefore no reissuing of new employee stock options equal to the time value, or the time, yes, the time value. Okay, so with all of the above in mind, here's some comments. All right, the restricted stock pays to the grantee when the stock goes up, down, or stays the same. The earnings are diluted, even the earnings of the company are diluted when the stock goes down, and they're still granted, it's still a nice cost to them. Cash flows to the company come only from the tax deduction with the restricted stock. Alignment is generally until vesting, and most of the time ends 100% of the time at vesting, unless there are provisions requiring holding certain number of shares beyond vesting. Traditional employee stock options pay the grantee only when the stock is higher. Amounts paid to the grantee become higher than the above restricted stock payments only when the stock is about 34 or higher. Alignment ends when exercise and sales are made. Substantial cash flows come to the company upon exercise. Risk management is difficult as the remaining time value is forfeited back to the company upon early exercise. Hedging with exchange-traded options is the only efficient risk reduction strategy for holding of TSOs under these circumstances. And of course, the companies and the wealth managers don't want them to hedge for various reasons. And the last comment on the dynamic employee stock options, they pay the grantee only when the stock is higher, just like the traditional employee stock options. Payments consist of the intrinsic value when exercises are made. The amount is subject to tax immediately when you exercise and creates substantial flows to the company. The amount of the remaining time value is returned to the grantee in the form of new dynamic employee stock options. The dynamic employee stock options allow the efficient management without hedging and extends alignment somewhat while generating early cash flow, earlier than normal cash flows to the company, because the grantee with the dynamic employee stock options can efficiently exercise early and probably will exercise early, therefore creating substantial cash flows to the company earlier than even restricted stock, surely, and traditional employee stock options, because they won't be as readily exercising. Okay, so here's the conclusion. Restricted stock has the shortest alignment of grantee to the shareholders. Restricted stock pays the grantee when the stock is up, down, or is the same, and is not a true performance equity regardless of what anybody says. Restricted stock generates the smallest cash flows to the company. Dynamic employee stock options have the longest extended alignment of grantee with shareholders. Dynamic employee stock options earn gains for the grantee only if the stock goes higher after the grant and is truly a performance equity. Dynamic employee stock options generates the earliest and the largest cash flows to the company. Dynamic employee stock options make the risk management by the grantee much more efficient, and it even benefits the wealth managers getting earlier cash flows and give them more comfort when they're advising early exercises, because one of the biggest penalties of early exercising, which is the forfeiture of the time value, is no longer there, and therefore the wealth managers can advise early exercise, sell, and diversify without being claimed violating their fiduciary duties. So that sums this presentation up. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it's meaningful to you. Thank you for listening.